Hello everyone. In the last lecture we looked at the appeal of fascism for many Europeans in the 1920s and 30s. Today we turn our gaze to the political and economic situation that followed the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression in Europe, events that many saw as a failure of democratic government and the ideology of liberalism. Whereas your textbook focuses on events in the major European powers, as always, we will also be looking today at the 1930s in the European periphery. The mid to late 1920s were a stable period of democratic consolidation in Europe. Countries such as France experienced a booming economy and a quietening of the vociferous protests and industrial strife that had characterized the immediate post-war period. Middle-class financiers and industrialists collaborated extensively to restore calm to Europe, backed by the seemingly limitless financial muscle of the United States, with American investment pouring into the continent and credit easy to access. Even in troubled Germany, riven by bloodshed during the early years of the decade, foreign loans had, by 1927, enabled industrial production to regain its pre-war high. That same year, the Reichstag addressed the vital need for social and class reconciliation by voting for a compulsory unemployment insurance plan. Germany now had the most advanced social welfare system in the entire world. Reforms at home were accompanied by a stabilization of international relations. The UK established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1924. Germany was granted membership in the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, in September 1926, and in 1928 dramatically signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which promised to outlaw aggressive war entirely. This agreement was also signed by nearly all of the world's major countries during the next year. Popular novels such as All Quiet on the Western Front showed how horrific wars were to fight in, and disarmament conferences were common across the world. Greece and Turkey, who had fought a horrific war with each other in the early 1920s, one which saw a bloody and disorderly population transfer between the two countries, suddenly made a remarkable rapprochement. Not everywhere in Europe at the time was tranquil. In Norway, a miserable economic situation saw unemployment reach as high as 20% in 1927. In Poland, much needed currency reform stabilized the economy, but a dispute with Germany led to financiers in Berlin and Vienna deliberately crashing the new currency in 1925. In May 1926, Marshal Pilsudski came out of retirement and staged an armed demonstration against the government in Warsaw. Fighting in the capital ended in a victory for Pilsudski, who effectively ran the government until his death. That same year, a coup saw the end of democracy in Portugal, where it would not return for 49 years. When Bulgaria's president, Stambolijski, sought to put the Macedonian dispute with Yugoslavia to bed once and for all, he was brutally murdered in a right-wing coup. In Italy, elections were abolished, free speech disappeared, and the fascist government dissolved all opposition parties and trade unions. The 1929 Wall Street crash and the Depression in the USA were significant in Europe for two reasons. In material terms, the crash dried up the easy credit that had underpinned the tenuous feeling of normalcy during the previous 5 years. On top of this, the collapse of the world's largest capitalist economy also greatly discredited capitalism and, by extension, political liberalism and democracy. No longer did the world appear to be making progress and leaving the old ways of conflict and hardship behind. Now it was liberalism itself that appeared old and ineffectual, unable to utilize society's resources to rescue the desperate economic situation. This was to have a dramatic impact in Europe, as we shall now see by sweeping through the continent. In Ireland, now the Irish Free State, the mass unemployment and miserable economic conditions that followed the Great Depression saw a collapse of the government of William Cosgrave, who had pursued a policy of close ties with the UK. Cosgrave had reluctantly supported the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, which had left the island of Ireland divided, with the North remaining in the UK. He was replaced by Eamon de Valera, a veteran of the Easter Rising, who had been born in New York. De Valera's subsequent 15-year stint in power would be defined by his constant attempts to defeat British influence in Ireland. De Valera stopped all back loans to Britain and pushed the British into beginning a trade war on imports. Whilst the British won the economic side of the war, it encouraged enough resentment in Ireland that De Valera was able to strengthen his grip on power, and in 1937 he ratified a new constitution. This constitution threw off the rule of the king entirely and transformed the Irish Free State into the Republic of Ireland. Worsening economic conditions saw the Communists re-emerge in Finland following their suppression in the Finnish Civil War and the subsequent White Terror. In reaction, the fascist Lapua movement emerged to suppress the Communists, in the process pushing Finnish politics far to the right. The Communists were prevented from taking part in the 1930 election, and an anti-communist law was passed which banned the public activities of the Communist Party, forced its members underground, and stripped them of their right to vote. The Lapua movement then bit off more than they could chew by going after the Social Democrats. Following a failed coup in 1932, the movement was banned. The same year, prohibition, in place in Finland since 1919, was repealed. In neighbouring Norway, the economy crashed even further, with a third of the workforce now unemployed. Unemployment and the falling cost of agricultural goods crashed the Estonian economy. A new constitution in 1933 gave sweeping powers to the figure of the president. Konstantin Päts became acting president and was expected to prepare the ground for the first presidential election. Instead, he proclaimed a state of emergency on March 12, 1934. Opposition leaders were arrested, the political activities of all parties were forbidden, and Päts assumed dictatorial powers. Latvia, by contrast, experienced economic growth. But even here, in May 1934, Prime Minister Karlis Ulmanis dissolved the parliament and all political parties and established authoritarian rule. On April 11, 1936, Ulmanis declared himself president for life. Antanas Smetona had already declared a dictatorship in Lithuania as early as 1926. His nationalist regime restricted rights for Polish speakers in the country, at the same time as it cracked down on Nazi and communist agitators, sentencing people of both groups to death. Poland's politics and economics lurched from crisis to crisis, even as the country's arts and culture flourished. Peasants went on strike in the countryside and workers in the towns. In 1935, the Polish president, a close ally of Pilsudski, was given dictatorial powers. In May that year, however, the great man himself died, leaving Polish politics with a sizable vacuum and no one really in charge anymore. Both fascists and socialists attacked the authoritarian government, all wanting to shape Poland in their own way. Non-aggression pacts were signed with the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, although the latter began to loudly pronounce its desire to reintegrate Danzig and the Polish corridor into Germany. Overall, the country lacked friends in Europe due to its insistence that it conduct an independent, semi-authoritarian foreign policy. Poland's most important alliance was with France, although that country remained torn with conflicts of its own. Austria was a strange place in the 1920s, with a large capital, Vienna, which had over 1 million residents, but only a small rural heartland. This period was known as Red Vienna, as the city was controlled by a social democratic government who heavily invested in building new homes for the city's poorest, as well as introducing new welfare measures. When the Depression arrived in Austria, it hit hard in a country subjected to war reparations and with no real natural resources to speak of. Even the Social Democrats cut spending and took measures to prevent inflation, sorry. They took deflationary measures to prevent inflation. Calls for closer relations or even unification with Germany were widespread. The Austrian Nazis emerged as a serious force in politics. Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss came to power in May 1932. Like his counterparts in Poland and the Baltics, he believed that the Western form of parliamentary government had been forced upon Central Europe as a result of military defeat and socialist revolution, and that the political and social order could be restored only by the establishment of a dictatorship. Dollfuss saw Austria as having two ideological enemies, the Marxists and the Nazis, who threatened the very basis of the conservative order. In reaction, he determined to replace parliamentary government with an authoritarian system. In March 1933, Dollfuss declared that the parliament had proved unworkable. It never met again in full, and Dollfuss governed thereafter by emergency decrees. He turned to fascist Italy and authoritarian Hungary for help against Nazi Germany, as he was convinced that the British and the French would be ineffective in their aid. This shift in foreign policy can also be attributed to the fact that Dollfuss had to rely ever more strongly on the help of the fascist Heimwehr to stay in power. The Social Democrats were subject to increasing provocations and on February 12, 1934, took to arms. Civil war followed. After 4 days of fighting, Dollfuss and the Heimwehr were victorious. The Social Democratic Party was declared illegal and was driven underground. In the course of the same year, all political parties were abolished except for the Fatherland Front, which Dollfuss had founded in 1933 to unite all conservatives together. The Great Depression strengthened Mussolini's hold on power in Italy, as his international reputation and as well as his international reputation, as he was able to contrast the supposed chaos in the US with domestic serenity and a clear-minded policy at home. The government increased spending on building roads and on welfare in order to provide employment, and rescued the banks and many large industrial companies. Large state institutions were set up to bail out failing firms and to provide capital for new industrial investment. They also provided managers and effective financial supervision. Italy thus acquired a huge state-led industrial sector, which was especially important in banking, steel, shipping, armaments, and the supply of hydroelectricity. After 1931, vast tracts of land were reclaimed through the draining of marshes in the Lazio region, where gleaming new towns were created with fascist architecture. On the other hand, wages fell, and the so-called corporations, which were mixed bodies of workers and employers that the fascist government organized to resolve labor disputes, had little impact in practice. Mussolini's Italy relied on smoke and mirrors more than genuine cooperation. The story of Hitler's ascension to power is well known and is covered in your textbook, but one aspect I'd like to consider here is the incredible levels of violence that the Nazis were willing to use. Even before coming to power, Nazis would heckle opposition politicians, following them after their speeches and beating them up in back alleys. Communists and Social Democrats were often outright murdered, either from being shot or with improvised weapons such as chair legs. The democratic conservative government did little, and whatever small actions they did take were loudly booed in the Nazi press. Meanwhile, bank after bank collapsed, and the Berlin stock market was in complete and utter chaos. Fear reigned in the hearts of most Germans. Although it is true that Hitler was gifted power at a time when Nazi support was waning, there was a widespread disillusionment with democratic Germany across the political spectrum. Once they were safely in power, the Nazis immediately set out imprisoning or shooting their enemies, this action actually earning them support from middle-class Germans happy that the party were restoring order to the German streets. The Soviet Union, now run by Stalin, earned international praise for the way in which it seemed immune to the Great Depression and rapidly industrialized its economy, becoming a world power in the span of a decade. This was accomplished at the cost of millions of lives as workers experienced impossible conditions, building new railways in the Arctic and entire new towns in the brutal Ural Mountains. Perhaps the most controversial of Stalin's economic policies was the process known as collectivization in the late 1920s and early 1930s, which involved taking the land off of the peasants and forcing them to work in large conglomerate farms run by the state. These farms had certain quotas of food to produce, which could then be delivered to the cities, on paper, in an orderly manner. The peasants overwhelmingly resisted this forced redirection of their lives, especially those who had been able to earn meager profit by selling the food that they grew on their plots. But to say the government didn't care would be an understatement. Tens of millions of peasants were taken from their farms, usually by idealistic communist volunteers from the cities. Peasants resisted by killing their animals and burning their grain, and a mass famine killed between 6 and 8 million people, mostly in Ukraine. Just like with the Irish potato famine, food continued to be exported from the hungry regions of the Soviet Union even at the famine's height, with the full awareness of Stalin and his advisors. Agricultural France at first seemed immune to the Great Depression, connected as it was to financial institutions and heavy industry. After 1931, however, economic strife hit France hard. Opponents of the Republic, on both the left and the right, came out in force, in an atmosphere of nervousness accelerated by Hitler's rise to power in Germany. In February 1934, the far right staged a huge rally near the Chamber of Deputies, which degenerated into a bloody battle with armed police, during which 15 rioters were killed and 1,500 injured. The regime survived this crisis, but serious stress persisted. Right-wing agitation was countered by unity of action on the left, with the grouping of all left-wing parties together in the Popular Front. Even the communists participated in this effort. The Populist Front, led by the Jewish socialist Leon Blum, lasted only 2 years, being weakened from the start by the refusal of the communists to play an active part in government. Reforms for workers went too far for some and not far enough for others. All the while, Hitler's Germany grew in power and France did nothing to stop it besides building up its fortifications and reaching out for alliance with Eastern Europeans. Britain, distracted by 25% unemployment rates and an empire in terminal crisis, offered France little in the way of help.